The misguided landing. Agent ZX-19 had prepared for everything except kindness. His mission briefing had covered Earth's military capabilities, technological advancement levels, and cultural weak points. Nothing in his training had mentioned what to do when a small human female offered him chocolate chip cookies. The landing hadn't gone according to plan. His stealth pod's navigation system had malfunctioned, sending him crashing through the roof of a modest farmhouse in Montana instead of the designated landing zone in the Rocky Mountains. As he emerged from the smoking wreckage, his biomorphic suit automatically adjusted to match human appearances, though he wasn't entirely sure it had gotten the proportions right. "Oh, you poor thing." The elderly woman standing in her destroyed kitchen didn't seem concerned about the smoking crater in her ceiling. Instead, she was looking at ZX-19 with what his emotional scanner identified as worry and grandmotherly concern. She wore a flour-dusted apron and held a wooden spoon in one hand. "You must be the exchange student the Henderson family was expecting. Though they didn't mention you'd be arriving by, whatever this is." ZX-19's 4 auxiliary brains scrambled to process this opportunity. His mission was to integrate into human society and gather intelligence about Earth's defenses. This misunderstanding could provide the perfect cover. He accessed his database of human languages and names. "Yes, I am Zach," he managed, trying to modulate his voice to sound less like the crystalline frequencies of his native tongue. "I apologize for the unconventional arrival. My transportation was irregular." "Well, that's putting it mildly." The woman chuckled, already moving to her refrigerator. "I'm Martha Sullivan, retired schoolteacher and, if I do say so myself, maker of the best snickerdoodles in 3 counties. The Hendersons are away at their daughter's wedding in California, but you're welcome to stay here until they return. I've got plenty of room since my Harold passed." ZX-19, now Zach, found himself ushered into a chair at a small kitchen table covered with a cheerful checkered cloth. His scanners detected no weapons or surveillance equipment, just the lingering scent of baked goods and something his database identified as potpourri. Thank you," he said, watching as Martha efficiently moved around her partially destroyed kitchen, somehow managing to produce a plate of cookies and a glass of white liquid despite the debris. "You are not concerned about the damage to your dwelling?" "Oh, that old roof needed replacing anyway," Martha waved her hand dismissively. "Now drink your milk before it gets warm. You look like you've had quite a journey." Zach cautiously sampled the milk, his taste analyzers working overtime to process the unfamiliar substance. His species absorbed nutrients through their exoskeleton, and the sensation of actually consuming sustenance was novel. The cookies proved even more intriguing. His scanners couldn't quite categorize the complex blend of sugar, butter, and what Martha called her secret ingredient. As the evening progressed, Martha shared stories about her teaching career, her late husband's adventures as a small-town veterinarian, and her opinions on the proper way to make pie crust. Zach found himself fascinated by the way she could turn simple observations about weather patterns into complex metaphors about life. "You know," Martha said, looking at him over her reading glasses as she cleared away the dishes, "you remind me of my Harold when he first came back from the war. Same lost look in your eyes. Sometimes the best thing for feeling out of place is having something to do. How about tomorrow I teach you how to make my famous apple pie?" Zach's mission parameters didn't specifically mention baking instruction, but they did emphasize gathering information about human culture and customs. "I would be honored to learn your traditional food preparation techniques," he said formally. Martha laughed. "We'll work on making you sound less like a textbook too. Now, let me show you to the guest room. We'll need to get you some proper clothes tomorrow. That silver jumpsuit might raise a few eyebrows at the grocery store." As Zach lay in the unfamiliar construct humans called a bed that night, he reviewed his situation. His pod's cloaking device had activated just in time to avoid detection by the primitive Earth satellites. His cover story seemed secure. But something about Martha's easy acceptance and genuine kindness made his standard mission protocols seem suddenly inadequate. He sent his required daily report to Central Command, successfully infiltrated human settlement. Established cover identity. Beginning cultural investigation through. He paused, considering how to phrase this, traditional culinary apprenticeship. As he powered down for his rest cycle, Zach could hear Martha humming in the kitchen below, already preparing for tomorrow's baking lesson. For the first time since accepting this mission, he felt something his databases couldn't quite categorize. It might have been anxiety about maintaining his cover, or perhaps it was something else entirely, something his briefing had never prepared him for, the beginning of belonging. Kitchen disasters and cultural lessons. Zach discovered that Earth measurements were frustratingly imprecise. His first attempt at baking went spectacularly wrong when Martha told him to add a pinch of salt to the cookie dough. "What is the exact molecular quantity of a pinch?" he had asked, holding the salt container with careful precision. "Oh, you just take a bit between your fingers, like this," Martha demonstrated, completely unaware that her casual gesture was causing all four of Zach's auxiliary brains to short-circuit in protest at the lack of scientific rigor. He had attempted to calculate it mathematically, which resulted in cookies that could probably have been classified as chemical weapons in most developed solar systems. Martha had simply laughed, scraped the smoking remains into the trash, and said, "Well, that's one way to learn. Let's try again." The concept of cooking with love proved equally baffling. But how does one quantify emotional input as a recipe ingredient? Zach had asked, genuinely distressed. Is there a standard unit of measurement for affection in relation to baking temperature? Martha's response of, "You just feel it in your heart, dear," was absolutely useless from a scientific standpoint, but Zach dutifully recorded it in his mission logs anyway. His daily reports to Central Command became increasingly focused on the peculiarities of human food preparation. Day 15, humans appear to have developed a complex system of cultural transmission disguised as family recipes. Subject Martha insists that her pie crust technique is superior to Mrs. Johnson's across the street, though spectrographic analysis shows minimal molecular differences. Further study needed. Living in a small town, Zach quickly learned, was like navigating an intricate social minefield where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. His cover story as a foreign exchange student worked well enough, but the residents of Silver Creek, Montana, had their own theories about the mysterious young man living with Martha Sullivan. Mrs. Peterson from the library was convinced he was a long-lost relative of Martha's late husband Harold. "He has the Sullivan nose," she'd whisper to anyone who'd listen, though Zach was fairly certain his biomorphic suit hadn't based its appearance on anyone's specific genetics. Tom at the hardware store thought he was a fancy chef from New York doing research on rural cuisine, a rumor that started after Zach attempted to explain the molecular composition of Martha's pie crust to him in scientific detail. The truth, of course, was far more complicated than anyone could guess. Especially now that Zach found himself actually enjoying his undercover role. He'd developed what Martha called a real talent for baking, once he stopped trying to calculate everything down to the atomic level and learned to trust his increasingly human instincts. His mission logs became increasingly difficult to write. Day 45, local humans continue to display unexpected behavioral patterns. Subject Martha has begun introducing me as my Zach to other residents. Unable to determine if this represents a claim of ownership or a designation of familial bonds. Both concepts require further study. Day 52, warning, have discovered that consumption of Martha's triple chocolate cake triggers unusual chemical responses in brain chemistry. Possible addictive properties. Request permission to conduct more thorough testing. Day 60, urgent update, have been recruited into local community theater production of Oklahoma. Martha insists it will be good for me to get out more. Send emergency extraction protocols immediately. This request was denied by Central Command, who seemed oddly interested in receiving video footage of the performance. The real trouble began when Martha decided to enter them both in the county fair's baking competition. The annual event was apparently a major social occasion, and Martha had won the blue ribbon for her apple pie 5 years running. This year, she insisted that Zach enter his own creation in the innovative baking category. But Grandma Martha, he said, the familial term slipping out before he could catch himself, my baking techniques are unconventional. That's exactly why you should enter. Martha beamed, either not noticing or choosing to ignore his momentary panic at the slip. Your raspberry lavender quantum physics cake was a revelation. Zach winced, remembering how he'd accidentally incorporated actual quantum uncertainties into the cake's structure, making each slice exist in multiple flavor states simultaneously until observed. He'd had to scramble to explain it away as molecular gastronomy. The fair preparation consumed their days. Martha taught him her secret techniques for achieving the perfect golden crust, while he contributed improvements to her methods that he insisted came from European cooking schools rather than interstellar culinary databases. But as their baking sessions continued, Zach found himself facing an unexpected crisis. His latest communication from Central Command contained disturbing news. They were so impressed with his detailed cultural analysis that they were sending another agent to study his integration techniques. Agent YR-23 was scheduled to arrive in 1 week, and unlike Zach's accidental landing, they would be fully briefed and prepared. The thought of another alien agent in Martha's kitchen, watching her, analyzing her, treating her as just another subject for study, it made something in Zach's carefully regulated emotional suppression system malfunction. One evening, as they sat on Martha's porch watching the sunset and enjoying slices of their latest experimental pie, time-displaced peach, though Martha thought it was just extra ripe, Zach found himself struggling with an unfamiliar sensation. Humans called it guilt. Martha, he began cautiously, what would you do if someone you cared about had been less than truthful with you? Martha set down her pie fork and gave him one of her teacher looks over her reading glasses. Well, that would depend on why they weren't being truthful, wouldn't it? What if they had a very good reason? What if they were protecting something important? Honey, Martha said gently, in my experience, the truth has a way of coming out eventually. Better to face it on your own terms than have it surprise you later. Zach nodded, processing this wisdom while watching the sun paint the sky in colors his home world never experienced. He had exactly 1 week to figure out how to protect Martha from both the truth and its consequences. His mission parameters had never covered this scenario: what to do when your test subject becomes your family. That night, after Martha had gone to bed, Zach stood in the kitchen, his kitchen now too, he realized, and made the most difficult decision of his 300-year existence. He began to bake. If he was going to risk everything, he was going to do it with style. And possibly quantum physics. After all, as Martha always said, sometimes you had to break a few eggs to make an omelette. Though in this case, he might be breaking several intergalactic protocols instead. The day Agent YR-23 arrived in Silver Creek, the sky turned an ominous shade of purple that the locals attributed to an incoming storm. Zach knew better. He was in the middle of teaching Martha his special, cosmic swirl, frosting technique when his embedded sensors detected the approaching ship. Looks like quite a storm brewing, Martha said, peering out the kitchen window. Though I've never seen clouds quite that color before. Zach's hands trembled slightly as he piped another perfect spiral. Perhaps we should focus on finishing these cupcakes before the weather turns, he suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. The county fair was tomorrow, and they had been perfecting their entries all week. The doorbell rang. Martha moved to answer it, but Zach quickly stepped in front of her. Allow me, he said, his heart's racing. It might be a surprise inspection from the exchange program. Opening the door, he found himself face to face with what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary human woman in a business suit. Only Zack could see the slight shimmer of a biomorphic suit and the telltale glint of auxiliary scanning organs behind her perfectly human eyes. "Agent ZX-19, she said in a voice that somehow managed to sound both pleasant and threatening. "Or should I say, Zack?" "Ms. Richardson," Zack replied, reading the name she'd chosen from her surface thoughts. "What an unexpected pleasure." Martha appeared behind him. "Oh, are you from the exchange program? Come in, come in. I just made a fresh batch of cupcakes. Though I have to say, your office never mentioned an inspection." "Thank you," Agent YR-23 said, following them into the kitchen. "I'm here to evaluate Zack's progress in cultural integration." What followed was the most awkward afternoon tea in Earth's history. Agent YR-23 watched with barely concealed fascination as Martha served her cupcakes and tea, asking questions that seemed innocent enough to human ears but made Zack increasingly nervous. "And you simply accepted him into your home?" YR-23 asked, delicately holding a cupcake as if it might explode. "Of course." Martha smiled. "He needed a place to stay, and this old house has been too quiet since Harold passed. Besides, he's become quite the baker." "Indeed." YR-23's eyes narrowed slightly. "His reports on human culinary practices have been most detailed." After Martha excused herself to check on something in the oven, YR-23 dropped her pleasant facade. "You've gone native, ZX-19, she hissed in their native frequency. "Central Command is concerned about your emotional contamination level." "I'm gathering valuable cultural data," Zack defended, though his voice modulator quivered slightly. "You're making cupcakes and participating in primitive social rituals. But that's not why I'm here." She leaned forward. "The invasion fleet is preparing to launch. Earth has been designated for colonization. We're to begin preliminary destabilization procedures immediately." Zack nearly dropped the teacup he was holding. "Invasion? But that wasn't part of the original mission parameters. Plans change. Your reports about human weaknesses have been most helpful in planning the initial strike." YR-23 smiled coldly. "Central Command thought you'd be pleased to know your research has been so useful." Martha returned with a fresh batch of cookies, humming her favorite baking song. Zack watched her arrange them on the plate with careful attention, just as she'd taught him, the slightly darker ones toward the back, the perfect ones displayed prominently in front. "The primary target will be these small rural communities," YR-23 continued in their private frequency. "Less resistance, maximum psychological impact on the population centers." Zack looked at the kitchen around him, at the recipe cards in Martha's careful handwriting, at the family photos on the refrigerator where she'd recently added a picture of him covered in flour, at the window box full of herbs they'd planted together. "When?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. 3 days. I suggest you conclude your research and prepare for extraction. Unless you'd prefer to witness the conquest of your test subjects firsthand?" After YR-23 left, Martha found Zack standing motionless in the kitchen, staring at nothing. "Are you all right, dear?" That woman seemed a bit intense. "Martha," Zack said slowly, "do you remember when you told me that sometimes the truth has to come out on its own terms?" "Of course. I think." He took a deep breath. "I think it's time I told you where I really came from. And then we need to figure out how to save your world. But first, could you teach me how to make those emergency disaster relief cookies you bake for the fire department? I have a feeling we're going to need them." Martha adjusted her reading glasses and gave him a long look. "Honey, did you really think I hadn't noticed that you glow slightly in the dark, or that your so-called innovative baking techniques occasionally defy the laws of physics?" Zack's auxiliary brains temporarily shut down in shock. "You knew?" "Dear, I was a high school science teacher for 40 years. Also, you crashed through my roof in a spaceship." She patted his hand. Now, about saving the world, I think I have an idea. But first, we really do need to finish those cupcakes for tomorrow's fair. There's nothing worse than facing an alien invasion on an empty stomach. Home is where the heart is. The morning of the county fair dawned with two suns in the sky, which, as Martha pointed out while calmly packing their baking entries, was really quite inconsiderate of the invasion fleet. Couldn't they have waited until after the judging, she muttered, carefully wrapping their special cupcakes in foil. We've worked too hard on these to let them go to waste. Zack, still reeling from the discovery that Martha had known his secret all along, watched in amazement as she efficiently packed up their entries as if alien warships weren't gathering in the stratosphere. Martha, perhaps the fair should not be our primary concern right now. Nonsense, she said firmly. Your plan needs a gathering of people, doesn't it? Well, the whole town will be at the fair. Besides, she added with a twinkle in her eye, I think these might be the most important cupcakes ever baked on Earth. The fair was already in full swing when they arrived, though people were starting to notice the unusual astronomical phenomena overhead. Zack could sense the invasion fleet's energy signatures growing stronger. They had less than 2 hours before the first wave would begin. Mrs. Sullivan, called out Mrs. Peterson from the judging table. Are these your entries? And in 2 categories this year? Yes indeed, Martha smiled, setting down their carefully packed containers. Zack and I have been experimenting with some very special recipes. The invasion fleet's warning message boomed across the sky in multiple languages, causing several jars of prize-winning jam to rattle on their shelves. People of Earth, prepare for colonization. Oh dear, Martha said, calmly unpacking cupcakes. They're early. Zack, dear, you might want to start distributing these now. Zack began passing out their special cupcakes to the gathering crowd, who were torn between watching the alien ships and enjoying the free baked goods. Each cupcake had been carefully infused with a combination of Martha's secret recipe and Zack's modified quantum harmonics. As people bit into them, their biochemical signatures began to change ever so slightly. Martha, Zack said quietly, are you absolutely certain about this? Trust the recipe, dear, she replied, adjusting her apron. Sometimes the best way to someone's heart really is through their stomach. The invasion fleet's energy weapons powered up, casting an ominous glow over the fairground. But something unexpected was happening on the ground. As more people consumed the cupcakes, their biological signatures began resonating at a frequency that Zack knew all too well. They were temporarily vibrating at the same wavelength as his species. Agent YR-23 materialized beside them, her human disguise crackling with anger. What have you done? Martha stepped forward, holding out a cupcake. Would you like one, dear? It's my special recipe, with just a hint of quantum entanglement, thanks to Zack's modifications. You've contaminated them. YR-23 hissed. The humans are now registering as family, Zack finished. Biologically indistinguishable from our own species, at least for the next few hours. The invasion protocols specifically forbid attacking genetically resonant populations. The invasion fleet's computers were going haywire, trying to reconcile the conflicting biological signatures from Earth. Thousands of humans, all suddenly registering as familiar species, all gathered in the target zone. You can't do this, YR-23 protested. It's a recipe for peace? Martha suggested, still holding out the cupcake. Sometimes family is who you choose, dear. And sometimes it's who chooses you. Perhaps it was the genuine warmth in Martha's voice, or the enticing aroma of the quantum-infused buttercream frosting, but YR-23 found herself accepting the cupcake. As she bit into it, her eyes widened in surprise. This is extraordinary, she admitted. The molecular structure, the quantum resonance, is that cinnamon? Family recipe, Martha winked. Would you like to learn how to make them? The invasion was called off within the hour. It's rather difficult to colonize a planet whose population registers as your own species, and even more difficult to explain why you'd want to after tasting their baked goods. Central Command was forced to revise their entire approach to Earth relations. 6 months later, Martha's Kitchen had become an unofficial intergalactic cultural exchange center. Every weekend, beings from across the galaxy would arrive, much more politely than Zack had, to learn the art of Earth baking. Martha took it all in stride, teaching quantum physicists and stellar engineers the proper way to cream butter and sugar. Zack's final report to Central Command was brief: Earth's true power lies not in their technology or defenses, but in their ability to turn strangers into family, one cookie at a time. Recommend immediate establishment of diplomatic relations, starting with cultural exchange program. P.S. Send more butter. Martha's apple pie went on to win not only the county fair but also the Intergalactic Baking Championship, though the committee had some trouble adjusting their scoring system for the effects of relativistic time dilation on baking times. As for Zack, he finally stopped trying to calculate exact measurements and learned to bake with his hearts instead of his auxiliary brains. After all, as Martha always said, home isn't just where you live, it's where you learn to rise. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between batches of cookies, he would look at Martha, his teacher, his grandmother, his savior of worlds, and marvel at how the universe's greatest treasures often come in the most unassuming packages, usually dusted with flour and smelling of vanilla.